Stop, the Mediterranean is a lie, and it's drying up again. What if the Mediterranean isn't permanent? What if it's a rented room with the lease running out? In the 1970s, a drill ship punched into the seabed and hit a continent-scale salt giant, proof the Med once withered to a brine pan. Now the same gate that failed then, the slim sill at Gibraltar, is showing familiar stress. If it slips, trade lanes, grain flows, and energy routes kink overnight. Here's the playbook. What actually happened, what's repeating on modern gauges, and who moves first when maps bend. There's one number at Gibraltar that flips everything, keep it in mind. Roadmap in 20 seconds. Okay, quick roadmap so you know why this matters and where we're going. Pillar 1 is the last collapse, the Messinian salinity crisis. Textbooks call it slow drawdown. The evidence doesn't agree. Deep-sea drilling project Leg 13 aboard Glommer Challenger cored stacks of gypsum over halite and tied them to a basin-wide seismic bright line, the M-Reflector. Translation: kilometer scale evaporites across deep basins. You don't get that without a near-closed sea and brutal water loss. Add the river canyon incisions. Nile cut toward abyssal depths. Rhône, Ebro, and Po sliced far below present base level. And you're staring at pulses, not a leisurely bath going stale. And when the Atlantic overtopped again at 5.33 million years, the Zanclean Flood didn't tiptoe. Modeling and canyon geometry point to peak discharges around 10.8 cubic meters per second. Thousands of Amazons, incising at rates measured in decimeters per day. That's a trapdoor, not a ramp. Pillar 2 is the modern dashboards. Start with Gibraltar, a thin rock sill controlling a superbasin's breathing. Africa-Eurasia convergence is slow but real. Uplift and microseismic creep around the Alboran, Gibraltar arc modulate that throat. Meanwhile, the Mediterranean has grown saltier and denser than the adjacent Atlantic. The outflow plume's density contrast is the engine that pulls oxygen and pushes salt. Tighten that gradient the wrong way and exchange chokes. Layer on circulation wobbles in the Atlantic, and the gate system starts acting like a valve you didn't mean to close. Coastal clues, delta retreat, odd river incision behavior whisper the same story, thresholds, not trends. One gauge at the gate, when the exchange budget flip sign becomes the tell. We'll flag it before we're done. Pillar 3 is geopolitics, because water physics doesn't collapse alone. The Suez Med chain is a stacked series of choke points. LNG, oil, refined products. Europe, North Africa, and the Levant use the Med as a pressure valve. Grain flows from the Black Sea to MENA ride this corridor. Nudge drought and routing risk together and you get price shocks that jump borders. Insurers, port rankings, and fleet allocations don't wait for geology to finish. They move on rumor and signal. That's why we'll pace this with 3 false endings. First, salt proves the desert. Then modern dashboards rhyme. Then the one number. Each closes a loop and opens a bigger one. Once you see the crime scene, the mechanism, and today's gauges, the timeline compresses. Let me show you. The 1970s salt giant, crime scene under the sea. Let's go straight to the crime scene. Summer of the early 1970s, the deep-sea drilling project's Glommer Challenger is lowering pipe through a quiet blue surface into what everyone assumed was just normal seafloor mud. Then the cores come up, gypsum capping thick halite, salt layered like a bakery stack, but not in a lagoon or a sabka. This is deep basin salt. The core photos look almost mundane, white, pinkish, translucent sections. But the lab notes read like a shock report. This shouldn't be here unless the basin was functionally cut off and evaporating at colossal scale. Now zoom out from the core barrels to the X-ray of the entire basin. Seismic profiles lighting up a basin-wide reflector, the M-Reflector, a bright, continuous horizon that cartographers of the subsurface began tracing across the western and eastern Mediterranean. That reflector isn't a rumor. It's a physical acoustic ping marking the salt giant's top. Tie that reflector to DSDP leg 13 holes, and you've got ground truth. Kilometer-scale evaporites widespread across deep floors. You don't build that in a slow, well-ventilated sea. You build that in a near-closed superbasin that's losing water faster than it's getting it. Here's what makes it weirder. Microfossils in and around those intervals blink in and out with missing sections and signs of desiccation stress. You see sapropel black layers elsewhere in the record, but right here, the evaporite logic takes over. Primary gypsum gives way to halite, and in places to potash, magnesium salts. That sequence tracks a brine climbing the evaporation ladder. It's chemistry as a stopwatch. The only way to time that much halite is to drop sea level, concentrate the brine, and repeat in pulses. Between packages, you catch erosion surfaces, breaks that whisper. It didn't dry once, it cycled. Now check the edges, the big rivers. The Nile carved down toward abyssal depths, with buried canyons imaged under the delta dropping well below present sea level. The Rhône, Ebro, and Po show overdeepened valleys heading seaward, their profiles not matching modern base levels. Those aren't lazy meanders, they're emergency exits for a basin whose floor stepped down and yanked river profiles with it. You can argue tectonics tilting shelves, but the geometry points to rapid base level fall punctuated by refill events. It looks like the drawdown took breaths. Every crime scene has a control point. Here, it's the Gibraltar Gate, a narrow sill, shallow by ocean standards, sitting at the interface of the Atlantic and the Alboran Western Mediterranean pocket. Make that sill a bit higher through uplift or a landslide choke, and the Atlantic-Med exchange throttles. Microseismicity and uplift patterns across the Baltic Rift arc tell you this margin is alive, slowly converging Africa toward Eurasia. In the late Miocene, the gateway wasn't a single door. It evolved from a wider, multi-branch connection into tighter throats, then likely pinched. The salt giant marks the aftermath. If it closed, how did it end? Enter the Zanclean Flood. We'll go deep on rates later, but one forensic clue matters now: the erosional scars. A 6-kilometer-wide amphitheater-shaped canyon near Malta, the incision downflow from the strait, and channel geometries consistent with peak discharges on the order of 10.8 cubic meters per second, thousands of Amazons at once. Bedrock scours, oversized sediment bodies, and basin-scale stratigraphic onlaps say the refill wasn't a trickle. It was catastrophic enough to carve and backfill in days to months, not millennia. Back to the deck of the Glamour Challenger for a second. Crew accounts from Leg 13 describe the moment cores revealed thick salts beneath deepwater muds. Surprise, a few quiet expletives, then a scramble to recheck logs. This wasn't a coastal oddity, it forced a rewrite. The M-Reflector turned the Mediterranean from a blue stable into a machine with a hidden-off switch. That switch, critically, sits at a sill that today remains comparatively shallow. One more subtle data strand: the way seismic packages step up toward margins with wedge geometries and local unconformities. They hint that water level didn't just fall once and sit, it flickered with thresholds. Some intervals show signs of reflooded conditions, marine microfauna returning, then more evaporites. That's a trapdoor mechanism in the rock. Cross the line and the system snaps downslope, cross it back and the Atlantic surges in. No drama needed, just a basin perched on delicate connectivity. So the crime scene notes read like this: basin-wide salt giant tied to a bright seismic marker, core-proven evaporite stacks, missing microfossil layers and desiccation signals, overdeepened river canyons into an empty basin, a control sill at Gibraltar in a tectonically restless arc, and megaflood scars documenting a refill with insane discharge. Put that together, and the logical verdict isn't slow, gentle drying. It's restricted basin crossing thresholds, pulsing toward desiccation, then catastrophic refill. And the trigger sits where it still sits today. File that away because the next question is timing. Was the fall gradual with a fast finale or staccato? The salts plus the canyons argue for steps, each one short enough to outrun river equilibrium. That matters because thresholds don't care about averages. They care about the exact moment a gate narrows just enough, a gradient tightens just enough, and the engine stalls. Keep your eyes on that engine at Gibraltar because the modern gauges are starting to rhyme with this file. Fast versus slow, the trapdoor mechanism. Most people were taught a slow-draining Mediterranean. Climate dries, evaporation wins, water drops, end of story. But when you line up the salt stacks, the M-Reflector, the overdeepened canyons, and the Zanclean megaflood scars, the pattern doesn't read slow ramp. It reads trapdoor. The difference matters. A ramp drifts, a trapdoor snaps. Here, what actually happens in a restricted basin with a single, shallow gate. As long as Gibraltar breathes, denser Mediterranean water spilling out, lighter Atlantic water feeding back in, the system holds. But that breathing depends on 3 levers staying within narrow bands: the sill geometry at the strait, the density contrast between basins, and the larger Atlantic circulation that keeps the feedstock coming. Nudge any lever past a threshold and the exchange chokes nonlinearly. You don't see a graceful fade, you see a stall. Textbooks treat the Messinian like one long drawdown because long looks tidy on timelines. The rock record won't let you get away with that. The evaporite sequence, primary gypsum into halite into potash, tracks staircase salinity. River canyons slicing far below modern base level tell you base level didn't sink politely. It stepped hard enough that rivers never caught up. And when the Atlantic overtopped, the Zanclean Flood's discharge estimates, on the order of 10.8 cubic meters per second, aren't compatible with a leisurely leak. That's a catastrophic gate failure. Atlantic water finding head, biting into bedrock, and switching the basin back on in what amounts to geologic minutes. So what trips the trapdoor? Start with the sill. The Batik Rift arc sits in slow Africa-Eurasia convergence. You don't need meters per century, you need millimeters accruing over centuries at the wrong spot. Add microseismic creep and slope failures. A slump can narrow an already skinny nozzle overnight in geologic terms. Then layer salinity physics. The Mediterranean today is saltier than the Atlantic. That density contrast powers the outflow. But if evaporation strengthens relative to inputs or Atlantic properties shift, the outflow plume densifies, the shear at the sill changes, and the overturning weakens. Push far enough, and you flip the sign on the exchange budget. In plain English, more going out than can be fed back in until the feedback can't sustain the basin. Now once you cross that line, timelines compress brutally. Evaporation over a near-closed superbasin doesn't nibble, it concentrates. Shorelines race basinward, deltas strand and cut, and the first big pulse of halite starts stacking across deep floors. That's your first step down. But thresholds cut both ways. Storm clusters, an Atlantic highstand, or a partial blockage clearing at the sill can spike inflow and pause the fall. That's how you get microfauna blinking back in and erosion surfaces between salt packages. The system tests the gate, briefly recovers, then slips again when tectonics and salinity shove in the same direction. Staccato, not symphony. Everything changes when incision takes control. As the basin drops, the hydraulic head between the Atlantic and Mediterranean grows. If the sill is even partially erodible, head plus sediment-laden flow turns the strait into a self-expanding nozzle. Early discharge is modest, but as the notch deepens, flow accelerates, shear stress skyrockets, and you blow past a second threshold. Supercritical conditions that rip a canyon into the gateway and trigger hyperpycnal jets across the basin. That's when the Malta amphitheater, the downflow channels, and the outsized gravels make sense. The flood feeds its own capacity. You might be thinking, okay, great for the Miocene, so what? Because the same mechanics don't care about dates. They care about geometry and gradients. Today, the sill is still shallow by ocean standards. The arc is still creeping. The density contrast still powers a two-layer exchange you can weaken by tightening salinity differences or by nudging the Atlantic's conveyor. And the modern record already shows the system twitching under climate variability. Mediterranean outflow water properties wobbling, the plume's core shifting, and Alboran dynamics responding to small changes in forcing. The trapdoor doesn't need a huge push. It needs the wrong push at the right time. Let me anchor this with a clean rule. In a gated basin, averages lie, thresholds tell the truth. As long as the exchange budget at the gate stays positive and the outflow plume remains buoyancy balanced, you're in the safe zone. Pinch the sill, raise effective salinity enough to choke overturning or starve the Atlantic feedstock, and you don't get a warning light, you get a mode switch. That's why the Zanclean Flood looks ridiculous on paper and inevitable in physics. Head plus erodible gate plus negative exchange equals snapback. This is the piece most people miss. Mechanism beats tempo. If the levers align, the med doesn't glide into trouble, it drops a floor. And once it drops, money, ships, and cities don't get a planning horizon, they get a shock. Hold that thought as we pull up the modern dashboards and watch the needles. The modern dashboards, are we back on the edge? Now let's pull the gauges. Start at the gate itself. The Strait of Gibraltar is a rock throttle where a two-layer exchange runs like a hidden conveyor. Salty, dense Mediterranean water spills out along the bottom into the Atlantic. Fresher Atlantic water slides in on top. That breathing keeps the basin ventilated. It only works if three things hold: the sill's geometry, the density contrast, and a stable enough Atlantic feed. Nudge any of those, and you don't get a gentle fade. You get the first cough of a stall. Geometry first. The Batik Rift arc sits on slow Africa-Eurasia convergence. GPS and seismic inversions show creep and uplift distributed around the Alboran, Gibraltar arc. We're not talking dramatic mountain building. We're talking millimeters to a few millimeters per year in the wrong places, plus microseismic slip and landslide-prone slopes on a narrow bedrock sill. The modern arc is complex rollback histories, nap stacks, but the short version is simple. This throat evolves. A little vertical change at the sill, changes hydraulic control far downstream. Now the engine, density. The Mediterranean today is saltier than the adjacent Atlantic by roughly a couple practical salinity units. That makes the outflow heavier, which paradoxically powers the in-out rhythm. Heavy water goes out, pressure and mixing draw lighter water in. But the gradient's tight. Intensify evaporation during hotter, drier summers, reduce net river inputs or tweak Atlantic properties, and the contrast tightens the wrong way. Observations in the Gulf of Cadiz show the Mediterranean outflow watercore shifting with climate modes. Studies of late Miocene restriction tie salinity flips to connectivity changes. It's a sensitive valve, not a fire hose. Layer in the Atlantic. When the larger conveyor wobbles, the headwaters feeding Gibraltar change character. AMOC variability doesn't need to collapse to matter here. A modest dip in upstream density structure or wind-driven exchange shows up at the sill as altered shear, modified stratification, and pulses in the inshore jet. The outflow plume, normally a coherent lens cascading down the continental slope, can thin, sink, or spread differently, which feeds back into how efficiently the surface inflow ventilates the Western Med. Think of it like a snorkel. Angle it a few degrees and you breathe harder. Field whispers back this story along the coasts. Deltas retreat faster than subsidence plus sea level rise alone predict. Incision anomalies show rivers nibbling at base level as if thresholds are near. In the Adriatic, Messinian legacy canyons hide beneath sediment, but modern rivers still react to short, sharp sea level and salinity swings. Around the Alboran, uplift and erosion coexist uncomfortably. None of these single threads scream catastrophe. Together, they spell a basin that responds in jumps. Okay, so where's the dashboard you can actually watch, not just infer? It's the exchange budget at the gate, the net transport balance of inversus out across Gibraltar. In practice, that's a combination of velocity profiles through the cameronal sill, density structure across the section, and the integrated salt and heat flux. When that composite slips towards zero or flips sign over sustained windows, you're no longer breathing, you're panting. Oceanographers do this with moorings, ADCPs, CTDs, and budgets that close on salt. It's not a mystery metric. It's a hard number with error bars. Here's the open loop I promised. When that exchange budget trends negative beyond normal seasonal and interannual wiggles, when the salt flux out can't be paid back by Atlantic inflow, you're in pre-failure territory. Not instant doom, a prelude. Why? Because the basin's salinity then ratchets upward, densifying the outflow further, increasing near-sill shear, and making the inflow work harder to climb the density staircase. That's textbook positive feedback in a gated basin. Cross a small structural or morphologic tweak at the sill while that's happening, and you get mode switch risk. But hasn't the Med been saltier than the Atlantic forever? Yes, and that's exactly why the gate matters. The system survives on contrast that still allows overturning. Increase evaporation and reduce freshwater inputs enough, and you tighten into a choke. Now couple that with the tectonic drift at the sill. We don't need a meter of uplift. Centimeters matter if they occur across the controlling notch or if a slump narrows the cross-section. Historic records show slope failures in straits worldwide, changing hydraulics overnight at human scales. A small slide in the wrong spot is a big deal here. Zoom out to trade math briefly because money moves before water does. Shippers, insurers, and energy desks already track med outflow indices and SUI's dwell times. Why? Because an exchange-choked western basin cascades into slower ventilation, warmer, saltier intermediate layers, and knock-on stratification shifts that affect everything from local fisheries to current-assisted routing. Grain traders price weather and route risk. LNG portfolios juggle Atlantic versus Med delivery optionality. If signals at Gibraltar start trending weird, spreads widen first. That's how you'll feel this before headlines, through premiums and diversions. Last gauge, coastal microseisms and tide gauge residuals around the Alboran can betray subtle circulation regime shifts. When internal tide energy and background stratification change together, you see it in frequency content and residuals. It's nerdy, but it's a real-time stethoscope on a system otherwise slow to confess. So are we back on the edge? The honest answer, we're closer to thresholds than most people think, and the needles that matter are twitching in the same directions that preceded the last failure. Tightening salinity contrast, an evolving sill, and a big upstream conveyor wobbling just enough to matter at a narrow throat. The one number at Gibraltar, the exchange budget, ties those threads into a single trigger. Keep that number front of mind, because when it tilts and stays tilted, timelines don't stretch. Maritime arteries on a timer. Trade, energy, food. Here, S where a geological threshold becomes a balance sheet problem overnight. The Mediterranean isn't just a sea. It's the short circuit of 3 continents' supply chains. If Gibraltar coughs and the basin's breathing slows, the knock-ons run through Suez, LNG schedules, refinery slates, and grain receipts before anyone says, salt giant. Start with the Suez Med chain. It's already a stacked Jenga of choke points. Bab el-Mandeb feeds Suez, Suez feeds the Central Med, and the Central Med hands cargo east and west through narrow approach channels. A wobble in one-block compounds across the stack. We've seen how even a single grounded hull or a week of missile threats flips freight math. Insurance premia spike, convoying slows, and ships detour around Africa, adding 10-14 days and 6 figures of fuel. Layer a Gibraltar exchange slowdown on top. Warmer, saltier intermediates, sluggier currents, more uncertain ETA windows, and schedulers bake in buffer days or choose the long way by default. That's capacity removed from the system without a single port strike. Energy next. The Med acts like a pressure valve between Atlantic LNG and the high-demand nodes of southern Europe and the Levant. Spot cargoes thread into the basin to arbitrage winter spikes, then back out to Spain, France, Italy, Greece, and Turkey. A ventilation choke doesn't kill deliveries, but it amplifies meteorology and draft constraints into reliability risk. When reliability drops, underwriters move first. War risk writers expand into route risk. Lenders, covenants ask for alternative port options, and charterers demand premium day rates for crews willing to eat uncertainty. Traders front-run that with wider bid-ask spreads at Greek and Italian markers, and marginal molecules peel toward Atlantic basins where laytime is predictable. Net effect: fewer flexible cargoes into the Med, more price volatility at the edges. Crude and products feel it too. North African grades and Eastern Med sweet barrels reach European refineries through approach channels that don't love long-period swell or odd stratification. If the basin grows more stratified and internal wave energy shifts, you get more weather holds at exposed terminals and tighter operating windows on single buoy moorings. Add Suez variability, convoys tightened, canal fees repriced, or precautionary slow steaming, and refiners hedge by raising inventories or pulling more from the North Sea and U.S. Gulf. That reweights pipelines and product tankers through the Atlantic, bidding up freight and cracking margins. You don't need a drought to move a diesel crack. You need planners who can't trust schedules. Now the fragile one, grain. The Black Sea to MENA corridor is one of the quiet backbones of food security. Wheat, corn, and sunflower oil inbound to Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, Lebanon, and beyond ride predictable slots through the Bosporus, across the Central Med into shallow draft ports that juggle swell, silt, and bureaucracy. Climatic hits already shorten harvests, route hits multiply price. If exchange at Gibraltar signals instability, more delays, fewer willing hulls, higher insurance, some owners refuse fixtures into the basin at standard rates. Freight blows out by dollars per ton, which at MENA volumes translates into budget holes for importers and price lifts on the street. A 10-20% swing on landed grain isn't manageable for subsidy-stressed treasuries. It's rationing pressure and political noise. Fertilizer is the hidden fuse. Nitrogen feedstock, gas, and phosphate chains cross this sea both ways. When LNG availability wobbles and voyage times stretch, ammonia and urea shipments shift timing and planting calendars slip. That misses yield windows. Even if you can buy the grain, you're chasing less of it. Food inflation becomes sticky because you're now solving logistics at the same time you're fighting agronomy. Ports and insurers price this early. Dwell time becomes the KPI to watch. If average box or bulk dwell at Central Basin ports trends up and stays up, terminal operators move to congestion surcharges, lines trim calls, and feeder networks fray. Draft limits creep tighter when swells and set down events force conservative pilots. Shippers re-rate reliability and push cargo inland by rail where possible. Iberia to Benelux, Italy to Bavaria, Maghreb to inland Morocco. Rail gets loved quickly when water gets weird. Fleet behavior is the tell. Owners shift tonnage lists away from ports with rising weird water days, more no-go windows from internal waves, more last-minute pilot cancellations, more tug unavailability and bad chop. That quietly lowers effective capacity in the basin. Rates rise first on marginal routes, then bleed into index benchmarks. You'll hear it as Mediterranean premium long before anyone blames a sill. This doesn't stay regional. When Atlantic ports pick up volume shed by Central Basin uncertainty, their yard productivity and truck turn times get tested. Azores and Madeira look less like postcards and more like mid-ocean waypoints for rerouting and bunkering. Red Sea pivots absorb Suez slowdowns but inherit risk. West African and U.S. Gulf exporters gain share into Europe, pushing different sulfur, octane, and blending specs, which refineries must chase or pay up for swaps. Okay, so what do players actually do when the needles twitch? Traders widen spreads and pre-position inventory outside the basin. Insurers rewrite exclusions, push rates, and blacklist terminals with rising incident frequency. Charterers bias to ships with dual routing optionality and crew comfort in difficult waters, paying for it in day rates. Governments quietly negotiate state-to-state liftings for grain and fuel, jumping queues. And capital, it follows reliability. Inland logistics assets and Atlantic-facing terminals re-rate up. Central Basin, shallow approach ports with silt problems re-rate down. The headline will say supply shock. The footnote will be Gibraltar exchange trend flipped 3 quarters ago. That's why we planted that one number. Money moves before water finishes the story. And when money starts moving, people do too, which is where we're heading next. The human pivot, migration, brain drain, city risk. Here's the quiet pivot nobody budgets for. When routes get unreliable and food risk feels local, people move first with their feet and then with their skills. And the Mediterranean rim is built like a domino line, coastal megacities, thirsty deltas, and youth bulges sitting on margins. Start with the physics that shows up in tap water. Coastal subsidence plus sea level variability plus salinity intrusion squeezes urban infrastructure from 3 sides. Delta cities, the Nile, the Po, the Rhône mouths, already battle saline fingers creeping up groundwater. A tighter, warmer, more stratified basin amplifies set-up events and internal wave surges that push brackish water upriver on still days. Utilities compensate with pumping and blending until energy costs bite. Then the rationing starts, hour blocks, district rotations, brown water fines. Households with options get ahead of the curve. Agriculture feels it as margin first, exit next. The olive, citrus, and grape belts work inside narrow moisture and salinity windows. When exchanges wobble and heat spikes stack, irrigation draw ramps just as water quality slips. Yields drop a little, then disease pressure rises, then labor turns over. Farm families do the same math city planners do and cash the last decent harvest to fund a move. Coast to inland, inland to rail nodes to Atlantic-facing ports. You watch it in school enrollments and building permits before you see it in censuses. Now the talent layer. Port economies live on predictability. Pilots, tug crews, crane techs, power engineers, maritime insurers, the whole logistics stack. When weird water days eat into work windows and insurers push exclusions, pay narrows and schedules go erratic. The best people don't wait for a mayoral press conference. They take lateral moves to yards and terminals with fewer no-go days. That looks like brain drain because it is. And once senior operators leave, incident rates climb, premiums climb, the next wave leaves. It's a feedback loop with a resume. We've seen this movie in other contexts. In the UK, when conditions tipped, housing, pay, workload, skilled departures outran arrivals 3-1. That's not a small leak. That's a professional class turning the valve. Translate the lesson. If Central Basin cities ask specialists to manage growing volatility without tools, neighboring hubs with steadier water and clearer budgets inherit the bench. Micro stories show up fast. A mid-sized port town logs 5 extra lost workdays in a quarter due to internal wave-induced swell at the berth. The pilots start texting about odd set downs and aborted approaches. The insurer flags the port for review. Within 6 months, junior crane operators are interviewing in Atlantic yards. The senior pilot is consulting 2 weeks a month in a safer strait. The Maritime Academy's best cohort signs contracts in Rotterdam and Le Havre. Nobody calls it climate migration. It's just careers following reliability. Security overlays arrive 1 season behind. Water competition hardens. Ag districts versus urban taps. Coastal hotels versus farms. Power rationing follows because salinity control is energy-hungry and grids bend under peak cooling loads. Police departments stretch to manage more theft from yards idled by schedule slippage, and crowd management gets added to harbor master meetings. States reach for old tools, temporary export controls on staples, cash stipends for strategic workers, military presence at key terminals. Those calm headlines, ensuring continuity of critical services, translate to people reading the room and moving their families. Urban planning gets caught mid-stride. Floodgates and storm sewers were sized for storm surges, not for internal tide regimes that make clearance windows unpredictable. When berths lose safe approach hours, ship calls slide toward daytime slack, stacking noise and traffic. Neighborhoods near terminals lose sleep and gain air pollution. Property markets flip, waterfront premiums flatten, inland logistics parks with rail spurs bid up. Landlords pivot to warehouse conversions, residents commute farther for steady pay. The city morphs toward freight and away from service, until the freight shifts elsewhere and the tax base thins. Youth red signals fastest. Entry-level jobs tied to tourism, fishing, and small-scale trade get choppy. Language schools and tech boot camps with pathways out of the basin fill first. Visa lawyers start offering portability packages tied to Atlantic hubs, Nordic grids, and inland water tech. The local cafe with engineering meetups becomes a departure lounge. It's not just a brain drain, it's a bandwidth drain, the energy of a place bleeding toward nodes with redundancy. There's also a second-order effect. Knowledge silos crack. The artisans who know exactly how to service a specific class of mooring or how to nurse a brackish intrusion back with minimal chemical load take that craft tacitly with them. Manuals can't replace 30 years of hands and eyes. Cities discover they've outsourced memory. So who holds their ground? Places that prove redundancy. Cities that diversify intake, desal with firm power behind it, groundwater protection, interties to inland reservoirs, retain households. Ports that demonstrate fewer lost workdays through tug upgrades, dynamic pilotage windows, and data-driven internal wave nowcasts, retain crews. Regions that build rail over water corridors give employers alternatives when voyage times wander. And governments that absorb insurance shocks for food and fuel keep tempers cool. The bottom line isn't panic, it's sequence. Reliability slips, costs rise, expertise thins, households hedge. Then the city's risk compounds. If you live on this rim, watch 3 dials: water quality advisories, port lost workdays, and net professional registrations. When they trend the wrong way together for 2 quarters, migration becomes policy whether leaders say the word or not. State reactions, dams, canals, and desperate engineering. Okay, so what do states do when a gated sea starts acting like a moody machine? They reach for levers, steel, concrete pumps, and law, trying to force reliability back into the system. Some of this is smart triage. Some of it is expensive denial. First lever, modulate the gate. Gibraltar looks like nature's valve, so the fantasy is you tune it. You'll hear proposals for submerged curtains, inflatable sills, or gated barrages that throttle the 2-layer exchange. Reduce bottom outflow on bad days, encourage surface inflow on hot spells. On paper, you balance salt and oxygen and buy time. In practice, you're fighting density with fabric and heavy internal waves under shipping lanes across microseismic slopes. Maintenance lives at the edge of safe diver work. One slump, one tear, and you're replacing canvas with lawyers. More hard-edged versions sketch caissons and partial sills. Engineered bumps on the cameronal throat to raise hydraulic control a few meters in damp extremes. That's billion-euro concrete in a zone that flexes. You will shift shear, you will move mixing, and you will surprise the modelers. Also, every knot of current you shave off there shows up in ETAs and fuel. Maritime lobbies will ask who pays when schedules slip. Underwriters will ask who's liable when a bulbous bow meets a tidal bore you just tuned. Second lever, feed the edges. If the basin trends saltier and rivers can't keep pace, ministries start drawing lines on maps to pour fresh water into coastal cells. Think mega dams and canals reviving old cross basin dreams. The ghost here is C-A-T-S, the 20th century fantasy of diverting Siberian rivers to arid southlands. Today's echo is milder but just as risky. Alpine transfer canals to the Po and Rhône shelves, Iberian interbasin grabs to prop Ebro deltas, even talk of Nile augmentation upstream to stiff-arm salinity intrusion. It's hydrology as geopolitics. Every cubic meter saved at a mouth is a farmer you angered upriver. Then come city-scale workarounds. Desalination build-out spike when taps taste brackish. The brochure says independence, the meter says gas bill. Reverse osmosis at coastal megacities runs on firm power and loves steady seawater. If internal tide regimes get choppier and intake sea swings in turbidity and jelly loads, plants trip more, filters foul faster, and your levelized cost of water creeps up. Stack 3 summers of peak demand and heat waves, and the grid buckles under peaking AC and desal. Governments promise batteries, finance reads, capex spiral. You'll also see ports and terminals militarized in slow motion. Not a coup, just a normalization of uniforms at gates because critical logistics need protection. Straits get patrol corridors, approach channels add mandatory convoys on certain days, exclusion zones widen under the banner of safety. That calms headlines, but it lengthens lines and nudges private owners to move ships and cargo to less policed, more predictable nodes. It's security theater in a place where physics is the antagonist. River capture whispers back in weird policy packets. If one shelf city can't keep its delta wet, policymakers float schemes to borrow neighboring catchments through tunnels and drops. The maps look tidy. The mountains do not. Tunneling under young origins is geotechnical roulette. Grout, water bursts, squeeze, repeat. Meanwhile, downstream ecosystems read the invoice in wetlands lost and fisheries altered. When the first cracks show up in canal linings during a hot summer, the public reads boondoggle. There's also the quiet engineering. Pilots, tugs, and berths upgraded to cope with internal waves and set downs. Dynamic windows for approaches driven by nowcasts, extra bollards for long-period surges, tug horsepower bumped across fleets. These are the moves that actually buy time. They reduce lost workdays without rewriting the sea. They're not glamorous ribbon cutters, so budgets starve them until the KPI trend forces hands. Behind all of it runs the finance problem. Desal, dams, curtains, and canals draw sovereign debt and private placements. Spreads widen when insurers and rating agencies start marking root risk into coastal balance sheets. If your grid already creaks and your current account leans on imported fuel and grain, piling capex for water hardware reads brave today, brittle tomorrow. Bond covenants don't care that gypsum once grew under your sea. History coughs up a caution. The last century's sea-level hubris, reclaim, dike, pave, worked until the boundary conditions shifted. Then maintenance ate budgets and storms rewrote plans. Repeat that pattern here and you'll trap cities in permanent emergency procurement. So what's left that scales sanely? 3 things. Protect groundwater like it's a strategic reserve. Managed aquifer recharge, salinity barriers on wells, and ruthless leak reduction in pipes. Harden port operability with data and muscle, not concrete fantasies. More tugs, smarter pilotage, better moorings. And diversify conveyance, rail over water corridors that give shippers a way to say, we can still meet Wednesday. Everything else? Dams, mega canals, gate curtains. They'll be tried, some will help briefly, many will backfire, and all will be paid for twice. Once at the ribbon, again in the retrofit. And while states argue over concrete, remember the needles. If the exchange budget at Gibraltar drifts and stays negative, none of this changes the basin's math. You don't negotiate with a trapdoor, you get off it. The suppression file, why this story was soft-pedaled. Okay, so if the rock record screams trapdoor, why wasn't this front page for 50 years? Simple, incentives. A lot of powerful sectors need the Mediterranean to be a postcard, not a machine with an off switch. Start with the Mediterranean brand. Tourism, coastal real estate, and blue economy boosters sell calm bays, predictable summers, and infinite sea. Try marketing kilometer-scale evaporites and a gateway that once failed catastrophically. Hotel syndicates and property funds don't lobby for nuance, they lobby for certainty. A rumor of basin instability hits yields and the ad copy gets nervous. Stability theater pays. Then there's national messaging. Sovereigns price their bonds against a story of dependable infrastructure and durable geography. Ports, grids, desal plants, and metros are collateral in policy speeches. You don't stand at a podium and say, our super basin is threshold sensitive, please buy this 30-year paper. You say, gateway of 3 continents open for business. Investor decks smooth over gate mechanics. Ministries issue glossy PDFs with dolphins and rail maps. Academia has its own gravity. The DSDP Leg 13 salt cores and the M-Reflector were a shock, but after the rewrite came a détente. Call it a salinity crisis, keep it climate-flavored, and file the catastrophic mechanics under ongoing debate. It's not a conspiracy. It's grant math. Proposals that emphasize incremental refinement of slow change models read safe to panels. The Strait is a threshold engine and timelines can compress. Reads like a career hazard unless you walk every caveat to the footnote. Reviewers reward caution. Headlines punish ambiguity. Shipping and insurance prefer predictable narratives too. Underwriters price what they can measure. Root risk, they understand war zones, piracy, storms. Internal tide regime shifting because a sill's density staircase changed. That's not an actuarial table, that's a headache. So the risk gets parked, premiums follow political maps, and hydrodynamics stay in the appendix. Charterers and P&I clubs ask pilots if approaches feel different. If the answer is sometimes, the line item dies quietly. Outlier scientists did warn carefully. They mapped the canyon scars, published Zanclean Flood discharge ranges around 10.8 cubic meters per second, flagged uplift and microseismic creep across the Batik Rift arc, and wrote that Gibraltar's hydraulic control is sensitive. But their strongest sentences got buffered by likely, consistent with, and pending higher resolution constraints. That's how you keep your lab open. Journal editors don't love trapdoor prose, even when the physics is clean. There's also institutional muscle memory. The last half-century of oceanography matured on long trends. AMOC means, decadal oscillations, slow salinity drifts. Funding, fleets, and mooring plans reflect that cadence. Threshold science demands dense arrays in nasty places and the political stomach to say, we may find a cliff. Cheaper to keep one ADCP across Cameronal, a few CTDs in summer, and publish variability papers. Meanwhile, the single-number budget, net exchange, stays a niche obsession among a handful of gate nerds. Geopolitics rounds it out. The Suez-Med-Gibraltar chain is baked into trade doctrines and naval logistics. Redraw reliability maps and you reorder fleet spacing and energy policy. That's not an op-ed, that's a decade of procurement. Better to lean on narratives that externalize shocks, weather, conflict, temporary congestion, than to admit a structural valve is twitching underneath. If the story is contingency, you surge escorts and reprice convoys. If the story is threshold, you need a Plan B map. One more subtle reason, cognitive comfort. Humans like ramps, not cliffs. A slowly drying sea feels manageable. Committees can task force it into 205. A machine that flips when a salinity gradient tightens and a sill creeps 5 centimeters is emotionally offensive to planners. So the culture calibrates itself to averages. 5-year means, decadal windows, and the rare mode switch gets labeled anomaly, then archived. None of this erases the rock file, it just explains the silence. The Salt Giant and M-Reflector forced the first rewrite. The Zanclean Flood forced the second. The modern dashboard, the exchange budget at Gibraltar, forces the third. And that's exactly where money looks earliest because capital doesn't argue with thresholds, it arbitrages them. So who actually benefits if the basin weakens? Not who you think. Atlantic-facing ports, mid-ocean hubs, and inland rail corridors that bypass water inherit the flow. Red Sea pivots gain leverage on Suez days. Underwriters with real gate models print premia. And early movers, those who reposition before the press conference, get paid twice. Let's map the winners and losers.
The static, operators, pilots, and choices. Start with a pencil and a breath. A waif in a drafty hut listens to a net she's heard for months. She knows the controller's bored tone, the way he lengthens a vowel when he's tired. Tonight, the Braden gap hits right on cue. She counts 27, 28, 29, then a soft counterfeit syllable lands where the inhale should be. Her pencil doesn't shake. She writes the time, circles it once, and adds a tiny arrow. Long lull. No drama, just a mark that will outlive the hour. Across the water, a German controller rubs his eyes and taps the mic twice, a habit he picked up in training and never shook. He's in the last half hour of his shift. The room smells of cigarettes and wet wool. He hears his own voice fade as he hands a track to the next sector and feels that thinness in the air, the seam he pretends isn't there. He reaches for the book because the book is safe. In that reach, a calm correction slides through the gap. He hears it, half registers it, and hates that he can't swear it was his. In the stream, a Lancaster navigator calls a bearing that isn't heroic. He's flown this route before. He trusts the hum he's learned to love, and the Meakin he doesn't know is walking the lane just a hair. His pilot asks for confidence. He answers with numbers that feel like ground. Minutes later, searchlights bloom where they shouldn't. They don't touch him. He marks the map with a dull pencil and doesn't ask why the corridor slid. He just flies the plan that's adjusting under his feet. Night fighter cockpit, a BF 110 crew who have worked together long enough to read breaths, not words. The radio is a companion and a judge. Kerr's Einsatzsway comes through like a yawn. He turns, the square on the set blossoms where caution lives. Frooned? Nah. He splits the difference with a practiced nudge. His gunner mutters something about English tricks. He answers with a shrug you can't see in the dark. He isn't a coward. He's a man who's learned the cost of being wrong in the wrong way. Back in the hut, the waif's tea is cold. She flips a page and redraws the ladder of beacon pips. 0, 30, 0, 30. Tonight one is late by a breath. She dots it and writes a tiny epsilon like the Malvern notes taught her to. The room hums with women breathing with machines. A new girl asks why the dots matter. The answer is a shrug and a half smile. When they line up, someone upstairs flies differently. That's enough. A Wuersburg van on a hill. The operator leans toward his scope as if closeness sharpens returns. Window blossoms like a storm trained to his drill. He tries the filter that worked last night. It calms the snow, then lies. He feels the lie in his gut, the way a musician hears a sour note. The controller asks for a confirmation that doesn't exist. He reaches for the knob again, because that's the only language both of them speak. Outside, the searchlight crew waits for a call that won't come. Corona desk, a refugee from Hamburg who lost a city and kept a voice. He carries Ruhr flat in his mouth and has learned to tuck it into exactly the right silence. He isn't here to taunt. He's here to place one word like a scalpel. When he keys Korrigieren, he does it gently. He knows there's a boy inside that cockpit who will hear home and obey. He also knows a stream full of crews will live because of that obedience. He swallows the taste of the trade he's making. An intruder crew sits on the edge of a false lane, throttled back to sound like home. The pilot can feel the drift the Meekin is gifting. The way the night fighters approach is being written by someone else's watch. He wants to chase. The navigator says wait, count 3, then look right. He counts. The shape blooms where the numbers say it will. The burst is short. The ether stays quiet. They don't linger for satisfaction. They slide away because the plan says the window is closing. Micro moments pile up in rooms that never meet. A sector chief reads a memo that blames pilots for being gullible and feels the heat rise in his neck. He writes a reply he won't send. A pilot lands light on fuel, finding anger an easier story than doubt. He tells the ground the voice lied. He doesn't tell them he wanted to believe the calm one. Back in Malvern, an analyst overlays 3 weeks of lulls and sees a red stripe where 2 rooms always stumble on relief. She writes attack here on a map that will decide who gets home. The war narrows to syllables and seconds because people make it so. A controller who double taps the mic without thinking. A waif who can hear the boredom in a voice she's never seen. A navigator who trusts a hum. A refugee who can wear an accent like a coat and lay it down when the room darkens. None of them thinks they're writing a doctrine. They're making choices under a clock someone else learned to play. And here's the sting that sits under all of it. Procedure keeps you safe until it doesn't. Trust carries you until it turns you. Every life in this net depends on deciding fast who to believe when 2 voices both sound like home. Some nights, a pencil circle is the bravest act in the war. Other nights, it's a thumb that doesn't twitch on an IFF switch because the gut says wait. In that wait, a bomber clears a cone of light. In that wait, a fighter burns a little more fuel and lands, angry and alive. D-Day's blindfold, operational payoff at scale. The night before the beaches, the air sounded rehearsed. Not ours, theirs. The same beacons hummed, the same nets clipped through preambles, the same pencils lifted on the half-minute. 100 groups score lay open. Mandrill pulses time to sector lulls, Corona cued on filler phrases, Meekins primed along return lanes, window bundles tagged with drop times that match the enemy's paperwork. You don't improvise an invasion. You make the other side improvise instead. While that was happening over the channel, something else was happening in France. Decoy traffic and feints, Fortitude's ghosts, asked the Germans to look at Pas-de-Calais. The radio war made that request sound plausible. Early warning lines blurred on cue, then cleared just long enough to misread a probe as main effort. In rooms from Cherbourg to Abbeville, controllers leaned closer to scopes that would go white on the beat and to voices that would trip on the handover. Window fell like rain with a metronome. Bundles went out heavy at the top of hours the Wiledgers said would push rooms into checks. Wuersburgs breathed, then breathed wrong. Vectors arrived late, then contradicting, then cautious. One sector chief, disciplined to the bone, stretched authentication to fight Corona just as the picture smeared. The seconds he spent getting the words right were seconds the streams used to cross the seam. Intruders sat on beacons, spines the Meekins had nudged. Homeward fighters, sent to cover threatened belts inland, found themselves flying lanes massaged a wing's width wide. A friend square bloomed near a chaff smear and bought one more cautious turn. That turn put a runway on a bad angle, and a mosquito waiting in the weeds lit a flare of cannon fire that closed the strip for the half hour the schedule said mattered most. Reserves moved like they trusted the grid. Night fighter belts slid toward DK lanes, then stalled when nets tangled at relief. A calm scrub last. Inside a filler phrase, unraveled a scramble meant to catch a Pathfinder flare. When control reasserted, the target field was already blind from timed jamming and a stack of window that the books hadn't imagined. It wasn't brute force. It was well-placed boredom meeting a well-timed blizzard. Here's a micro moment that reads like a hinge. A coastal sector at 29, logbook open, hears Ubergabe and breathes. Corona counts 4, says one number, 215, then goes silent. The new controller, steady and good, authenticates by the book while the Wuersburg blooms. His fighter obeys the earlier correction and flies 5 miles south of where he'd have been. On the beaches, tracers arc. In the ether, that 5 miles is a lifetime. The German answer tried to be confident. Orders pushed night fighters toward fixed belts the planners trusted. Flak nets rose to cover gaps scopes refused to fill. But the nets had learned to distrust IFF at exactly the moment the clone boxes wanted them to. Frooned nah, a square said, and a vector sidestepped its own chance. Multiply that by hours, then map those hours onto a morning where paratroopers needed a sky too noisy to be precise. By dawn, the ledger looked like a cheat. Early warning blurred at the right times, scopes lied on the right beats, voices tripped in the right lulls, and reserves stepped the wrong way because the clock told them to. The invasion didn't need every trick to land. It needed enough friction in the net to make bold decisions feel reckless and cautious decisions feel safe. The radio war supplied that feeling on schedule. And here's the sting. After the worst passed, controllers did what they always did, wrote cleaner procedures, longer preambles, stricter overlaps, fresh memos, useful in peacetime. On that night, procedure had been the blindfold, the beachhead held while the other side tried to read a book that someone else had already underlined. Post-war autopsy, what NATO learned, what others forgot. In the quiet after, the people who'd lived inside the noise wrote their verdicts. The files don't read like victory laps. They read like checklists stripped for parts. British analysts wrote in plain ink, never run a net on a clock the enemy can learn. Randomize beacons. Shift call signs irregularly. Break handovers with overlaps tested by outsiders who don't care about your comfort. Don't just encrypt content, hide the cadence that gives you away. NATO would build on those lines. Manuals got a new obsession, emission control as choreography, not just silence. You didn't run a beacon every hour on the hour. You nested duty cycles in patterns that looked like weather. You seeded jitter with sources nobody at the console could predict, crypto-random timers and diceware before chips made it easy. If the operator could feel the rhythm, the enemy could too. So you took the rhythm out of human hands. Red teams became doctrine. The lesson wasn't just jam more. It was hire people who enjoy breaking your rules. RAF veterans who had played Corona now ran exercises that imitated imposters with permission slips. Controllers learned to be doubted in training, so they'd recognize the feeling in combat and not freeze when a false calm slid through a sea. Challenge words moved from ritual to a tool that could land anywhere in the sentence, unannounced. Scripts loosened where it mattered, and strictness shifted to the randomness itself. You obeyed unpredictability. TRE's culture, measure, iterate, never trust your first success, bled into NATO's labs. Engineers treated timing like a material, not an afterthought. IFF got windows that flexed, backoffs that varied, and decay curves that punished anything too eager by default. The aim wasn't to be unspoofable. Nothing is. It was to be expensive to spoof at scale. Make the attacker earn every square they paint, then move the paint when they reach for a pattern. What nobody knew at the time was how hard institutional memory would be to keep. The early Cold War took the Luftwaffe's cautionary tales seriously. Exercises hammered home that metadata kills, not what you say, but when and how often you say it. Allied navaids pulsed on pseudorandom plans. Controllers got graded as much on their variability as their vectoring. The lesson held, while the people who'd been burned still had a voice. Meanwhile, something else was happening in peacetime. Convenience crept back. Civil aviation boomed. Predictable beacons made training easy and traffic safe. Military nets borrowed habits from a growing civil sky. Rote schedules calmed controllers, juggling more airframes than any wartime sector had seen. Manuals thickened again. A new generation learned that order kept disasters away, true most days, fatal on the one day an adversary took notes. There's a small story from an early NATO exercise where the Red Team, staffed by veterans who'd once worn headphones in huts, asked permission to run, friendly mimic. They weren't there to embarrass anyone. They wanted to test the overlap doctrine that post-war committees had blessed. In the first hour, a single misplaced syllable during an authorized handover induced 3 crews to hesitate. Nobody crashed. The after-action read like a warning not to confuse paperwork for resilience. The fix was more live-fire red teaming, not thicker scripts. Electromagnetic discipline became part of architecture. Antennas got side lobe suppression by default, so a small imposter near the edge couldn't outshine a big beacon over the horizon. Networks learned to vote on trust. If one sensor saw a friend and 2 saw a smear, you didn't call it safe. If voices tripped a challenge, you didn't just reset, you flagged the operator's timing for analysis. The point was to instrument the human beats the war had exploited, then feed them back into coaching before bad habits calcified. But here's the irony that history likes. The further you move from the night rooms of 43, the easier it is to forget that cadence is a target. Some forces slid back into rigid EMCON windows that red teams could set their watches by. Others adopted digital authentication, but kept predictable prompt timing. The same opening the clone boxes had loved, now at higher frequencies. Even in the age of spread spectrum and frequency agility, crews sometimes trained on patterns so consistent a middling listener could map them over coffee. Technology advanced. The old leak, procedure on rails, kept finding its way back through convenience, culture, and turnover. NATO's better units wrote guardrails against amnesia. They embedded randomness in code and hid the knobs from operators. They punished predictability in exercises the way they punished safety violations, because the risk rhymed. They rotated voices across sectors to break accent maps. They moved red teaming out of special events and into the calendar like dental work. Routine, unwelcome, necessary. They told new controllers a plain truth. If your timing makes your night easier, it probably makes the enemy's job easier too. Post-war autopsies didn't romanticize deception. They respected craft and warned against laziness. The British files say it without flourish. The Luftwaffe's system was elegant and brittle because it trusted its clock. Future networks should treat clocks like live munitions, handled carefully, never left lying around where an adversary can pick them up and use them. People forget. That's why procedures must assume forgetting and still refuse to become habits you can set a watch by. And the last note in the margins is the hardest to keep. Measure iteration speed, not just accuracy. The side that adapts within days beats the side that approves within months. If your fixes need signatures, your signatures need to move as fast as the other side's grease pencil. Otherwise, you'll end up like those rooms, smart, disciplined, and a step late to a beat your enemy is already counting out loud. The meaning and the warning. A checklist blinded an air force because nobody asked if the clock was the enemy. If this pulled back a corner of how wars are really won, by timing, not thunder, subscribe. Watch our deep dive on the invisible supply line next to see how logistics hid in plain sight while radios lied. Then tell us which quiet leak you want exposed, because the most dangerous pattern is the one your system calls
Practical
normal.
navigation, signals, safe havens, timing. Okay, here's how you steer this without a PhD or a Bloomberg terminal. Start with the one number, the Gibraltar exchange budget. You want to see a routinely published, instrumented net, salt and volume, closed across the cameronal sill. If it's not public, that's a signal by itself. If it is, watch three things: multi-season trend, variance versus known modes, and whether the salt budget repays without deepening the density penalty next month. A sustained slide beyond seasonal wiggles is your first yellow light. Pair it with two live proxies. 1. Outflow plume behavior in the Gulf of Cadiz. When the Mediterranean outflow water core sinks anomalously or spreads erratically along the slope, the surface inflow is climbing a steeper density staircase. 2. Sill geometry whispers. You're not chasing millimeters everywhere. You're scanning for concentrated change, uplift, or roughness across the controlling notch, plus any documented slides that narrow cross-section. A small slump in the wrong spot matters more than a big quake in the right one. Now convert science to dashboards you can actually pull. Port KPIs, average dwell time, pilot aborts, tug unavailability, and weather holds specifically attributed to internal waves or set-down events. If those creep for 2 quarters at 2 central basin ports you care about, you act. Insurer blacklists and surcharge memos arrive quietly. Ask your broker if terms are shifting for particular terminals and approach windows. Draft limits tightening more often than historical norms. That's physics turning into policy. For food and inputs, track 2 indices and 1 shipment class. Grain basis spreads Black Sea FOB to North Africa CIF. If they widen and stay wide outside harvest and conflict cycles, logistics is wobbling. Fertilizer export schedules, ammonia, urea, phosphates. If voyages delay into planting windows, local yields will echo it. Add reefer reliability. If cold chain boxes report more plug-in or clearance failures at central basin hubs, perishables are losing the schedule race. Career and capital pivots, bias toward redundancy. Languages, Spanish, French, German, Dutch, Bayou rail over water careers from Iberia to Benelux when ships get weird. Sectors with structural tailwinds here. Inland logistics, rail operations, water tech, desal O&M, managed aquifer recharge, leak detection, grid stability, and maritime pilotage enhanced by internal wave nowcasts. Consider certifications that travel. DP, dynamic positioning, cold chain auditing, and high voltage operations. Geography hedge in tiers. Avoid last-in-line nodes with shallow approaches and chronic silt issues unless they're funding tugs, moorings, and data. Prefer Atlantic-facing ports with rail doors to inland consumption, dry ports welded to double-stack corridors, and inland cities that sit on 2 rail lines and have room to add sheds. If you must live coastal in the basin, pick municipalities that publish water quality advisories weekly, invest in MAR ASR, and disclose non-revenue water targets. Timing matters. This isn't a siren, it's a sequence. Phase 1. The exchange budget leans negative beyond noise. LNG and grain spreads widen. Insurers test language. That's when you pre-position inventory outside the basin, renew leases with flexibility clauses, and line up alt routes. Phase 2. Port KPIs drift. Lost workdays, aborts, dwell, while a minor slide or uplift patch is reported at the sill. That's your cue to reallocate fleet lists, pull kids out of schools near volatile terminals, and move job searches to Atlantic or rail hubs. Phase 3. 2 insurer surcharges stick, and a second central basin port shows persistent anomalies. At that point, treat temporary as structural. Relocate, refinance, and exit assets that need blue water to be nice. Safe havens look boring. Signs with a rail spine. Bilbao with steel to France. Le Havre, Antwerp, Rotterdam with yards that clear box stacks on Wednesdays without drama. Inland, Zaragoza, Lyon, Cologne, Strasbourg, dry ports and cold stores pointed at tracks. Red Sea pivots for surge work, Jeddah, KAP, if you can price risk and stomach convoys. Wildcard, Tanger Med, if it keeps tugs strong, pilots rested, and rail humming. For households, keep a simple triple check. If your city posts more water quality advisories, your port logs more lost workdays, and your professional cohorts registrations are net down 2 quarters in a row, you are late. Move on quarter 3, not headline 9. For small businesses, negotiate med premium pass-throughs now, don't eat them later. For investors, underweight assets that need calm basins. Overweight rail, inland logistics, Atlantic terminals, and tug upgrades tied to KPI covenants. One last thing, demand data. Ask ports to publish internal wave days, pilotage aborts, and exchange linked delays. Ask ministries for salt closed Gibraltar budgets with error bars. If they won't show you the stethoscope, assume the patient's not great. The takeaway is blunt. The Mediterranean isn't a forever sea. It's a gated machine with thresholds, and the gate's needles decide your timelines. If this helped, subscribe and turn on alerts, then watch next. My deep dive on the other closing gate you're ignoring. If you've got friends in ports, trade, or coastal cities, share this now so they can track the right numbers before the headlines catch up.